Elara Voss felt the growl before she heard it, a low sound rolling under her ribs like distant thunder trapped inside a cave. The blood moon ceremony had barely begun, and already something was wrong. Hundreds of pack members stood in the frozen courtyard of Ashgrove Keep, torches hissing against the cold night air, and every eye was fixed on the tall figure descending the stone steps toward her. Alpha King Draven Ashgrove moved like a man carved from discipline itself, his shoulders squared, his jaw set, his pale eyes scanning the crowd with practiced calm. But underneath that calm, Elara heard him. Not his voice, not his breath. Something deeper, older, and far less composed. She had been born moon-blessed, a gift so rare that even the elders of her own pack had only heard stories of it. Tonight, under the full silver light, that gift had finally woken inside her, and it had chosen the worst possible moment to do so. As Draven approached, Elara heard a second presence layered beneath his measured words. A voice thick with hunger and unrest, snarling somewhere just behind his eyes. It was his wolf, and it did not sound like a king's wolf should. The pack elder beside her, an older woman named Bridget with silver hair pinned into tight braids, placed a firm hand on Elara's shoulder and whispered that this was the greatest honor a young woman from a lesser pack could ever receive. Elara barely heard her. She was too busy trying to keep her expression still while a second voice, wild and raw, whispered a single word into the base of her skull. Mine. Then another. Finally, Draven stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint gold ring around his irises, a mark of alpha blood passed down for generations. He studied her face, the way a man studies a locked door, searching for a crack. You are Elara Voss, he said. His voice was steady, formal. Exactly the voice a king should use in front of his people. Yes, your grace, she answered, forcing her tone into something smooth and unaffected. The moon has chosen you as my mate, he continued. Do you accept this bond? Behind his measured words, the growl surged again, sharper this time, almost desperate. Elara realized with a jolt that his wolf was speaking directly to her, separate from the man standing above her, as though it existed as its own trapped creature clawing at the inside of his skin. She had never heard anything like it in any shifter before. Wolves and humans usually moved as one voice, blended together into a single presence. Draven's wolf sounded like it was fighting to be heard over something else entirely, something buried and important. I accept, she said aloud, because there was no other answer to give, in front of a courtyard full of witnesses and firelight. The crowd erupted into cheers, drums picking up a slow, triumphant rhythm, other shifters howling in celebration, toward the enormous moon hanging low over the mountains. Draven took her hand, and the moment his skin touched hers, the growling voice inside him surged louder than ever, no longer distant thunder, but a storm breaking directly over her head. Words tumbled through her mind, fractured and urgent. Not her fault, not this one. Don't let them see. Liar, liar, liar. Elara kept her smile fixed in place, the same practiced smile she had used for years while healing wounded pack members who screamed in pain during treatment. The smile that told everyone watching that everything was under control, even when it was not. Inside, her mind raced. Whatever secret lived inside Draven's wolf, it was not calm, and it was not proud of the crowd's celebration. It sounded like something that had been carrying an unbearable weight for a very long time. The feast that followed stretched long into the night, tables groaning under roasted meats, spiced bread, and small clay cups of dark honeyed wine. Musicians played near the bonfire while children weaved between adult legs, laughing, chasing sparks that drifted up from the flames. Elara sat at the high table beside Draven, playing the part expected of her, nodding politely at nobles who congratulated her on securing the greatest match any woman in the Northern Territories could hope for. She smiled, thanked them, and all the while listened. Draven rarely spoke more than necessary. He answered questions with short, controlled sentences, the kind a man gives when he has learned that fewer words mean fewer chances for mistakes. But his wolf never stopped murmuring beneath the surface. Sometimes it was simple frustration, a low hum of irritation at the noise and attention. Other times it slipped into something rawer, something that sounded almost like grief. Once, when an elderly nobleman clapped Draven on the back and praised his late father as a legend among kings, the wolf's voice cracked entirely, letting out something between a whimper and a snarl that made Elara's stomach twist. She glanced sideways at Draven's face. Nothing had changed there. His expression remained calm, his nod polite, his thanks measured and gracious. If she had not possessed her gift, she would have believed him entirely unaffected. But she had heard the truth underneath, and the truth was that mentioning his father had struck something deep and painful inside him. Later, when the feast wound down, and servants began clearing platters of half-eaten food, Draven walked her personally to the private wing of the keep, reserved for the Alpha's family. The halls were lit with soft lanterns, shadows stretching long across polished stone floors. He walked a measured pace beside her, hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing, until they reached a heavy wooden door, carved with the Ashgrove crest, a wolf circling a crescent moon. "This will be your chamber," he said. "If you need anything, the staff will assist you. Tomorrow we will discuss your duties as Luna." "Thank you," she said. He hesitated, something flickering behind his composed exterior. For a moment, Ilara thought he might say something else, something real. Instead, he simply nodded and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Alone in her new chamber, Ilara sat on the edge of an enormous bed, piled with soft furs, and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for hours. The stone walls were thick, the fire in the hearth crackling gently, and for the first time all night, she allowed herself to think clearly about what she had heard. A king's wolf whispering the word liar to itself, over and over, was not something that happened without reason. Wolves reflected the deepest truths of their human counterparts, truths often too dangerous or too painful for the human mind to speak aloud. If Draven's wolf believed its own king was lying, then somewhere beneath the polished crown and practiced calm, something significant was being hidden. Something that had happened long before tonight. Ilara thought of her own life, the quiet years spent training under her pack's healer, learning to stitch wounds and brew medicine from mountain herbs, never imagining she would one day sit inside the private chambers of the most powerful Alpha in the territories. She had grown up hearing stories about the Ashgrove line, tales of strength, honor, and unbroken leadership passed from father to son for centuries. If those stories were built on a lie, the consequences could shake every pack loyal to the throne. She rose from the bed and walked to the narrow window overlooking the courtyard below. The bonfire still burned, though smaller now, its light flickering against the dark tree line beyond the keep's outer wall. Somewhere out there, pack members were returning to their homes, believing they had just witnessed a joyful union between their king and his chosen mate. They had no idea what Ilara had heard, no idea that the very wolf sworn to protect their kingdom seemed to be haunted by something it could not forgive. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find a young woman about her own age, dressed in the simple gray uniform of the household staff, holding a tray with warm tea and a small plate of honeyed bread. "I'm Clara," the young woman said with a shy smile. "I was told to check on you before the night ends. Congratulations on your bonding, my lady." "Thank you, Clara," Ilara said, accepting the tray. "Might I ask you something?" "Of course." Ilara chose her words carefully. "Has the Alpha always been so quiet? So controlled?" Clara's smile faltered slightly, replaced by something more cautious. "He wasn't always like this," she admitted after a pause. "When his father was alive, he used to laugh more. Everything changed after the accident." "Accident?" "The old king's death," Clara said, lowering her voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. "It happened 5 years ago. Some say he fell from the northern cliffs during a routine patrol. Others whisper it wasn't an accident at all. Draven doesn't speak of it. No one does, not anymore." Ilara's pulse quickened. "Why not?" "Because the last person who asked questions disappeared shortly after," Clara whispered, "and no one ever saw him again." A chill crept up Ilara's spine that had nothing to do with the cold night air slipping through the window. Clara seemed to realize she had said too much, straightening quickly and offering a polite bow before excusing herself, mumbling something about needing to help finish cleaning the feast hall. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Ilara alone once more, with her tea slowly cooling and her mind spinning through everything she had just learned. An accident that some believed was not an accident. A man who vanished after asking too many questions. A wolf whispering the word liar beneath a king's calm expression. Ilara had arrived at Ashgrove Keep, expecting to become a queen. Instead, she was beginning to suspect she had stepped directly into the center of a secret, dangerous enough to make even a king's own wolf afraid of the truth. She set the tea aside, climbed into the enormous bed, and stared up at the shadowed ceiling for a long time, before sleep finally took her. Somewhere down the hall, she imagined Draven lying awake as well, his human face calm against the pillow, while his wolf continued pacing restlessly inside him, guarding a secret that Elara now knew existed, even if she did not yet understand what it was. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would begin paying closer attention, not just to the words Draven spoke, but to the truth trembling beneath them. Whatever secret his wolf carried, it was clearly heavy enough to change a man from someone who once laughed freely into someone who measured every word like a soldier counting arrows before battle. And if the rumors about a missing man were true, uncovering that secret could prove far more dangerous than simply becoming a king's mate ever could have been. Outside, the last of the bonfire embers glowed orange against the dark, and the full moon continued its slow climb across the sky, indifferent to the storm quietly gathering beneath the surface of the kingdom it had just blessed. The following morning arrived cold and clear, sunlight spilling weakly through the frost-covered windows of the keep. Elara woke early, her mind still turning over everything Clara had told her the night before. She dressed simply, choosing a plain wool dress suited for the chilly stone corridors, and made her way toward the dining hall, where she had been told breakfast would be served. Draven was already seated at the head of the table when she arrived, a plate of untouched food in front of him, while he reviewed a stack of parchment reports. He looked up as she entered, rising slightly out of habit before settling back into his chair. "You slept well, I hope," he said. It was not quite a question. "Well enough," she replied, taking the seat across from him. "Thank you for the chamber. It's lovely." He nodded, returning his attention to the parchment. Elara studied him quietly while pretending to focus on her own plate, listening carefully beneath his calm exterior. His wolf was quieter this morning, though still present, a low simmering unrest, rather than the sharp anguish of the previous night. "Might I ask about pack duties today?" she said carefully. "I would like to understand my responsibilities as Luna." Draven set the parchment aside. "Rhea will guide you through most of it," he said. "She oversees the healers and much of the daily operations here. You'll find her efficient and honest, qualities I value highly in the people around me." Something in his tone shifted slightly on the word honest, and beneath it, his wolf let out the faintest, almost mournful sound. Elara filed the reaction away carefully, careful not to let her expression reveal anything. "I look forward to meeting her," she said simply. A servant entered moments later to announce that Rhea had already arrived and was waiting near the healer's quarters. Draven excused himself shortly after, citing pressing matters with the border patrol captains, leaving Elara to make her way through the unfamiliar halls alone. As she walked, she thought about the strange contrast she had witnessed. A king who spoke of honesty as a virtue, whose own wolf howled the word liar beneath the surface of his calm words. Whatever truth Draven was hiding, it seemed to be eating away at him, just as much as it might eventually threaten everyone around him. She reached the healer's quarters and found a tall young woman with warm brown skin and sharp, intelligent eyes, organizing jars of dried herbs along a wooden shelf. The woman turned at the sound of footsteps and offered a genuine smile, one of the first unguarded expressions Elara had seen since arriving at the keep. "You must be Elara," the woman said, wiping her hands on her apron before extending one in greeting. "I'm Rhea. Welcome to the chaos." Elara laughed despite herself, shaking Rhea's hand. "Thank you. I've heard good things." "All lies, probably," Rhea said with a wink, though her tone carried genuine warmth. "Come, let me show you around. There's a great deal to learn, but I promise it isn't as frightening as the courtyard ceremony made it look." As they walked together through rows of medicinal herbs and healing supplies, Elara felt something settle inside her for the first time since the previous night. Whatever secrets waited within these walls, whatever dangerous truth Draven's wolf continued to guard, she finally had someone beside her who felt like a genuine ally, rather than a stranger performing politeness. She did not yet know how deeply she would come to rely on that friendship, or how far the two of them would eventually go together, in pursuit of a truth the entire kingdom had been trained never to question. But as Rhea continued speaking about herb rotations and seasonal treatments, Ilara's mind kept drifting back to one lingering thought: a missing man, an accident that might not have been an accident, and a king's wolf that could not stop whispering the same haunted word into the quiet corners of his own mind. Whatever waited ahead, She suspected her days at Ashgrove Keep were about to become far more complicated than anyone had prepared her for. Weeks passed at Ashgrove Keep, and Alara settled into a rhythm that looked, from the outside, like the peaceful life of a new Luna learning her role. She spent mornings with Rhea among the herb shelves, learning which roots eased fever and which poultices closed wounds fastest. She spent afternoons walking the training grounds, watching warriors spar under the autumn sun, offering quiet nods to pack members who bowed as she passed. To anyone watching, she appeared content, adjusting well to her new life beside the Alpha King. But beneath that peaceful surface, Alara had not stopped listening. Draven's wolf had a name, she discovered one evening while sitting beside him during a quiet dinner. He mentioned it almost by accident, speaking of an old memory from childhood when his father had first taught him to run through the northern forests as a young pup. Caius wanted to chase every rabbit in sight back then, Draven said, a rare small smile tugging at his mouth. My father always said a wolf who cannot control his hunger will never control a kingdom. Caius, Alara repeated softly, testing the name. It fits him somehow. Draven glanced at her, curious. You speak as though you know him. I only meant it sounds fitting for a strong wolf, she said quickly, covering her slip. Draven studied her a moment longer before letting the comment pass, returning to his meal. Alara released a slow breath, reminding herself to be more careful. She could not yet explain to him what she heard, not until she understood what secret Caius was protecting, and not until she knew whether that secret made Draven dangerous or simply burdened. That night, alone in her chamber, Alara sat by the fire, turning the name Caius over in her mind. Every time she had heard the wolf speak, it carried the weight of something painful, something that felt less like guilt over a small mistake, and more like grief, tangled together with fear. Wolves did not fear their own human counterparts without reason. Something had happened, something significant enough to fracture the usual harmony between man and beast. She thought of Clara's whispered warning about the missing man, the one who had asked too many questions after the old king's death and had never been seen again. If Caius's guilt connected to that disappearance, then Draven himself might know exactly what had happened to that man, and might be carrying that secret alone, every single day, hidden behind a calm and controlled expression that fooled everyone except the woman fate had gifted with the ability to hear beneath it. The next morning, Alara found Rhea in the herb room, carefully labeling small clay jars with a thin brush and dark ink. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure how much she should share even with a friend she trusted, then decided that carrying this weight alone would eventually break her. Rhea, she said quietly, closing the door behind her. Can I trust you with something important? Rhea set down her brush immediately, her expression turning serious. Of course. What's wrong? Alara took a slow breath. I have a gift, she began. Something rare. Something I did not fully understand until the ceremony. I can hear the inner wolf of any shifter, separate from their spoken words. Most of the time, human and wolf sound like one voice blended together. But Draven is different. His wolf speaks separately, and lately, it keeps whispering the word liar, over and over, like it's haunted by something. Rhea's eyes widened slightly, though she did not look entirely shocked, more like someone confirming a suspicion she had quietly carried for a long time. That would explain a great deal, she said slowly. What do you mean? Rhea glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice further. Draven changed after his father's death. Everyone assumes it was simple grief, the natural weight of becoming king so suddenly. But I've worked in this keep for years, Alara. Grief fades, even slowly. What I've seen in him isn't fading. It's something he carries every single day, like a stone tied around his neck that never lightens. Alara leaned closer. Clara mentioned a man who disappeared after asking questions about the old king's death. Do you know anything about that? Rhea's expression grew cautious. I remember him, she admitted. His name was Soren. He served as a junior advisor to the old king, close to Draven's age. After the accident, Soren started asking questions publicly. Things like why the old king would patrol the northern cliffs alone at night, something he never did in the years before. A few weeks later, Soren vanished entirely. Officially, records say he chose to leave pack territory for personal reasons. Unofficially, no one has heard from him since, and no one dares mention his name around the keep. Soren, Alara whispered, remembering the exact name Draven's wolf had murmured during a quiet moment weeks earlier, a name she hadn't recognized then but now understood carried enormous weight. I've heard that name before, she admitted. Caius said it once, without explanation. Rhea's face paled slightly. Then whatever happened to Soren, Draven's wolf clearly hasn't forgotten it, even if the rest of the kingdom has been trained to. The two women sat in tense silence for a long moment, the weight of what they were uncovering settling heavily between them. Finally, Rhea spoke again, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. If we're going to look into this, we need to be careful, she said. Whatever happened, it was significant enough that someone made sure the truth disappeared along with Soren. If we start asking the wrong questions to the wrong people, we could put ourselves in real danger. Alara nodded slowly. Then we start quietly, she said. We look at old records, old patrol schedules, anything from the weeks surrounding the old king's death. We don't confront Draven yet, not until we understand what we're truly dealing with. Agreed, Rhea said. Though I'll admit, part of me hopes we find nothing significant at all. Sometimes the truth beneath old grief is simply sadness, nothing more sinister than that. Alara wanted to believe that too, but the memory of Caius's anguished voice, repeating the word liar with such raw desperation, told her otherwise. Whatever truth waited beneath Draven's calm exterior, she doubted it would turn out to be simple. Over the following days, Alara and Rhea began their quiet search, careful never to appear too curious in front of the wrong eyes. Rhea, given her long-standing position within the keep, had access to certain archived records stored in a small library adjoining the healer's quarters. Old logs detailing patrol assignments, supply shipments, and minor administrative notes stretching back decades. Alara spent her free hours there, poring over faded ink and yellowed parchment, while pretending to study healing texts whenever anyone passed by. She found the patrol logs from the week of the old king's death, almost by accident, tucked between unrelated supply records, as though someone had hoped they would simply be overlooked. According to official record, the old king had gone alone to inspect storm damage along the northern cliffs, a task typically assigned to lower-ranking patrol officers, rather than an alpha king himself. The timing struck Alara as strange immediately. Kings rarely handled routine inspections personally, especially not alone, without any guard escort. She brought her findings to Rhea that evening, spreading the borrowed parchment across a small table in Rhea's private quarters. Why would he go alone? Alara asked. Kings don't inspect storm damage themselves, certainly not without at least one guard. Rhea studied the parchment carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. Unless he wasn't inspecting storm damage at all, she said slowly. Unless the official reason was simply cover for something else entirely. A meeting, perhaps, Alara suggested. Something private enough that he couldn't bring his usual guard. Or something he didn't want witnessed, Rhea added grimly. The two women continued searching through records over the following nights, slowly piecing together a timeline that felt increasingly suspicious the deeper they dug. 3 days before his death, the old king had summoned Soren for a private meeting, according to a brief scheduling note buried within otherwise mundane correspondence. 2 days after that meeting, Soren began asking pointed questions among other advisors about pact succession laws and hidden clauses within ancient treaties. Then, the old king died during a solo inspection that broke decades of established royal protocol, and within weeks, Soren vanished entirely, erased so thoroughly from official records that only scattered rumors and hushed whispers remained of his existence. It felt too coordinated to be coincidence, Alara admitted one evening, as she and Rhea reviewed their gathered notes together. Someone wanted both the old king's true cause of death and Soren's knowledge buried at the same time. But who benefits from that? Rhea asked quietly. And more importantly, does Draven know the truth, or is he simply as trapped by these secrets as everyone else around him? Alara thought back to every fractured whisper she had heard from Caius since the bonding ceremony, every guilty murmur and anguished growl hidden beneath Draven's carefully controlled exterior. Something told her Draven knew far more than he let on, though whether he had actively caused Soren's disappearance or simply covered for someone else entirely, she could not yet determine. We need more information before we draw conclusions, she said finally. If Draven truly holds dangerous secrets, we cannot risk confronting him without understanding exactly what we're dealing with. But if he's simply protecting himself from something forced upon him by his father before his death, then perhaps compassion, not suspicion, is the right path forward. Rhea nodded slowly, though worry still lingered clearly in her expression. Just promise me you'll be careful, she said. Whatever secret this kingdom has been built upon, It clearly required silencing at least one person already. I don't wish to see that happen to either of us. I promise, Elara said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered how long she could maintain such careful distance from a man she was bonded to for life. A man whose wolf continued whispering desperate confessions directly into her mind every single day. Confessions she could no longer ignore, no matter how dangerous the truth behind them might eventually prove to be. That night, lying awake in her enormous bed while moonlight spilled through the frosted window, Elara listened to the distant sound of Draven's footsteps pacing in his own chamber down the hall. Restless and unable to sleep, she wondered if Caius's guilt kept him awake as often as it echoed through her own thoughts, and she wondered how much longer she could keep pretending she heard nothing at all. The library adjoining the healer's quarters became Elara's second home over the following weeks. She learned to move through the keep at hours when fewer eyes watched her, carrying stacks of ordinary healing texts as cover whenever she carried older records back and forth between shelves. Rhea joined her most evenings after her own duties ended, the two women speaking in low voices while candlelight flickered against stacks of aging parchment. One evening, while sorting through a box of correspondence that had clearly been shoved aside and forgotten, Elara found a letter that made her breath catch. It was written in careful, elegant handwriting, addressed to the old king from an unnamed sender, dated only weeks before his death. "The council grows restless," the letter read. "They whisper that your health fades faster than you admit, and some already question whether your son is prepared to carry the weight you leave behind. If you do not name your successor clearly and soon, others will attempt to name one for you." Elara read the words twice, her mind racing. Rhea leaned over her shoulder, scanning the same lines with a furrowed brow. "His health was failing," Rhea murmured. "I never heard anything about illness before his death. Everyone believed he died suddenly, unexpectedly." "Perhaps that's exactly what someone wanted everyone to believe," Elara said quietly. They continued searching, and found a second letter tucked behind the first, this one written in a different hand, sharper and more urgent than the first. "Soren has learned too much," the second letter warned. "He suspects the succession was never as clean as the council claims. If he speaks publicly, the entire kingdom could fracture into competing claims before Draven is ready to hold the throne. Something must be done quickly, before this spreads further." Elara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Someone believed Soren posed a threat significant enough to warrant urgent action, and shortly after, Soren vanished entirely. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. "Do you think Draven wrote this?" Rhea asked carefully, gesturing at the second letter. Elara studied the handwriting closely, comparing it against notes she had seen Draven leave for household staff regarding minor daily matters. The style felt similar, though not conclusively identical. Her stomach twisted at the possibility. "I don't know," she admitted, "but if he did write this, it doesn't necessarily mean he ordered anything violent. It could mean he was trying to protect his people from chaos, even if the method used against Soren went further than he intended or wished." Rhea nodded slowly, though her expression remained troubled. "We need to find out what actually happened to Soren," she said. "Whether he's alive somewhere, hiding, or whether something far worse occurred. Until we know that, we're only guessing at how deeply Draven is involved." Over the following days, Elara found herself watching Draven more closely than ever, listening not just for Caius's guilty whispers, but for any clue about his true character, beneath the calm exterior he maintained for his people. She watched him settle disputes between pack members with surprising fairness, watched him personally visit an injured warrior in the healer's quarters despite having no political reason to do so, watched him quietly slip extra food rations to a struggling family on the edge of pack territory without ever mentioning it publicly. He was not cruel. Whatever secret haunted him, it did not seem to stem from a heart that enjoyed causing harm. If anything, the guilt Caius carried felt like the weight of someone forced into an impossible situation, rather than someone who had chosen darkness willingly. One afternoon, while walking together through the training grounds observing young warriors practicing defensive maneuvers, Draven turned to Elara with an expression more open than she had seen from him before. "You've been different lately," he said. "Quieter. Thoughtful. I find myself wondering what occupies your mind so completely." Elara's heart raced, though she kept her expression composed. "Simply adjusting to my new responsibilities," she said carefully. "There's a great deal to learn." Draven studied her for a long moment, and beneath his calm exterior, Caius stirred restlessly, murmuring something that sounded almost like hope mixed with fear. She wants to know something. Don't let her find it. Please, don't let her find it. Alara kept her expression steady, though the desperate plea from his wolf sent a chill through her entire body. Whatever Draven was hiding, some part of him desperately hoped she would never uncover it, terrified of what might happen if she did. "Is something troubling you?" she asked gently, testing the waters carefully. "You seem burdened sometimes, even during quiet moments." Draven's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained even. "Kings carry burdens," he said simply. "It comes with the position." "That's not really an answer," she pressed softly. He turned to face her fully then, something vulnerable flickering briefly across his controlled features, before disappearing again behind practiced composure. "Some burdens are not mine alone to share," he said quietly. "Even with a mate. Especially with a mate." The words struck Alara harder than she expected. Whatever secret he carried, he clearly believed sharing it would cause harm, perhaps to her, perhaps to the kingdom, perhaps to himself. She wanted desperately to press further, to tell him what she could hear, to demand the truth directly. But something in his expression, some deep and genuine fear buried beneath his royal composure, stopped her. "I understand," she said instead, though privately she resolved to continue her search with Rhea, until she uncovered enough truth to understand exactly what burden Draven believed he needed to protect her from. That evening, back in the library, she relayed the conversation to Rhea in careful detail. "He's protecting me from something," Alara said, "or protecting himself from having to face it directly by speaking it aloud." "Perhaps both," Rhea suggested. "Guilt often works that way. Sometimes silence feels safer than confession, even when confession might bring relief." They returned to their search with renewed determination, pouring through additional archived records late into the night. Eventually, they found a brief entry in an old patrol log that neither had noticed before, buried within a stack of unrelated border reports. It mentioned a supply wagon traveling toward the Eastern Territories during the same week Soren disappeared, carrying, according to the brief notation, personal effects belonging to a departing advisor. "Departing," Alara repeated slowly. "Not captured, not silenced permanently. Departing." Rhea's eyes lit with cautious hope. If Soren truly left willingly, perhaps under some agreement or protection, then he might still be alive somewhere, living quietly under a different name. Or the wagon entry could simply be a cover story, Alara countered carefully, unwilling to let hope override caution entirely. "We need to know where that wagon actually traveled, and whether Soren truly boarded it willingly, or under duress." Rhea nodded slowly. "There's a retired border guard living in the village nearby, who worked patrol duty during that exact period," she said thoughtfully. "His name is Harlan. He's older now, retired from active duty, but he might remember details that never made it into official records." "Then we should speak with him," Alara said firmly, carefully, and without drawing attention. They agreed to visit Harlan together within the coming days, hoping his memory might finally provide clarity, where dusty parchment and cautious guesswork had only produced more questions. As Alara walked back toward her chamber that night, she found herself replaying Draven's words from earlier that afternoon. "Some burdens are not mine alone to share." Whatever truth waited at the end of this search, she suspected it would ultimately test not just her loyalty to uncovering justice, but her growing feelings toward a man who seemed, despite everything, to be fighting his own quiet battle against a past he never chose for himself. Lying awake later that night, Alara listened once more to the faint sound of Draven's restless footsteps, pacing beyond the shared wall between their chambers. For the first time since arriving at Ashgrove Keep, she found herself wondering, not just what he was hiding, but how much pain it must be causing him to carry that secret entirely alone, night after night, with no one beside him who understood the true weight of what haunted him. Perhaps, she thought, as sleep finally began pulling her under, uncovering the truth would not only reveal a dangerous secret, but might also finally allow Draven to set down a burden he had clearly been carrying for far too long by himself. The following afternoon, Alara and Rhea made their way toward the village, nestled at the edge of pack territory, dressed in plain traveling cloaks, meant to draw as little attention as possible. The village itself was small, a cluster of timber houses surrounding a central well, smoke curling from chimneys against the gray autumn sky. Harlan's cottage sat near the village edge, modest and quiet, with a small garden of withered vegetables lining the front path. An older man answered the door after several knocks, his face weathered by decades of outdoor patrol work, a thick gray beard covering most of his jaw. His eyes, though tired, remained sharp, studying both women carefully, before recognition flickered across his features. "You're the new Luna," he said, straightening slightly with old habit. "What brings you to my door?" "We hope to ask about something from several years ago," Rhea said gently. "A patrol matter, around the time of the old king's passing." Harlan's expression shifted immediately, wariness replacing his initial politeness. "That's old history," he said. "Best left buried, if you ask me." "We understand this might be uncomfortable," Elara said carefully, "but we believe someone's safety may depend on understanding what truly happened. Please, we only wish to know the truth." Harlan studied them both for a long moment, glancing briefly over their shoulders, as though checking whether anyone had followed them through the village. Finally, he stepped back, allowing them into his modest home, gesturing toward 2 wooden chairs, near a small fireplace. "I'll tell you what I remember," he said quietly, closing the door firmly behind them. "But understand, once I speak these words, there's no taking them back. Whatever trouble follows, it follows all of us." "We understand," Rhea said firmly. Harlan lowered himself into a worn chair across from them, staring into the low fire for a long moment before beginning. "I served on the Eastern Border Patrol during that period," he said. "Quiet duty mostly, watching for trespassers, escorting supply wagons. One night, I was assigned an unusual task, escorting a single wagon toward the eastern crossing, carrying 1 passenger. Soren," Elara said quietly. Harlan nodded slowly. He didn't speak much during the journey. Frightened, I remember thinking, not like a man simply relocating for personal reasons. More like a man running from something, or being sent away from something dangerous. "Did he say anything at all?" Rhea asked. "Only once," Harlan said. "Near the crossing, just before he departed. He told me if anyone asked, I should say I saw nothing. Then he said something strange. He said the old king's death wasn't natural, and that the current Alpha King knew far more than anyone realized. He said he wasn't running from Draven exactly, but from what Draven had been forced to protect." Elara's pulse quickened. Forced to protect. What did that mean? Harlan shook his head slowly. "I don't know exactly. He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask. My orders were simple. Escort him safely to the crossing, and speak of it to no one afterward. I've kept that silence for years. Until now." "Do you know where he went after crossing?" Elara asked. Harlan hesitated, then sighed heavily. There were rumors, years later, of a healer living quietly in a small border village beyond our territory. Someone who matched Soren's description. Someone who never spoke of his past life. I never confirmed it myself, but the rumors persisted long enough that I believed them true. Rhea and Elara exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken hope and renewed urgency. If Soren was truly alive, hiding quietly beyond pack territory, he might hold answers capable of finally revealing the entire truth behind the old king's death, and whatever secret continued to haunt Draven every single day. "Which village?" Elara asked carefully. Harlan gave them a name, a small settlement several days' journey beyond the northern border, known mostly for trade rather than political importance. "Understand," he warned. "If Soren truly wishes to remain hidden, finding him will not be simple. And if certain powerful people within this keep discover you searching for him, the consequences could prove severe for everyone involved." "We'll be careful," Elara promised. As they thanked Harlan and made their way back toward the keep beneath a darkening sky, Elara turned Harlan's words over carefully in her mind. Not running from Draven exactly, but from what Draven had been forced to protect. Whatever secret Caius carried, it increasingly seemed less like personal cruelty and more like an impossible burden placed upon Draven by circumstances beyond his control, likely inherited directly from his dying father. That evening, unable to quiet her racing thoughts, Elara found herself walking the quiet corridor outside Draven's private study, long after most of the keep had settled into sleep. Through the partially open door, she saw him seated at his desk, head bowed over scattered parchment, exhaustion etched deeply into his features, despite the late hour. She hesitated at the threshold, torn between the careful distance she had maintained for weeks and a growing pull toward honesty she could no longer entirely suppress. Finally, she stepped forward, knocking softly against the wooden frame. Draven looked up immediately, surprise flickering across his tired expression. "Ilara," he said, straightening in his chair. "It's late. Is something wrong?" "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, stepping into the room. "May I sit with you a moment?" "Of course," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. She settled into the seat, studying him quietly for a long moment before speaking again. "You look exhausted," she said gently. "More than usual." Draven rubbed his eyes tiredly. "Kingship rarely allows for rest," he said. "There's always another matter demanding attention." Beneath his weary voice, Caius stirred restlessly, murmuring something soft and pained that Ilara struggled to fully make out, fragments about wishing for forgiveness, about wanting to finally set something down after carrying it too long. She studied Draven's face carefully, searching for any sign that he might be ready to share the truth he had kept hidden for so long. "Draven," she said carefully, choosing her next words with great caution. "Whatever burden you carry, I want you to know I'm not afraid of difficult truths. If something troubles you deeply enough to keep you awake every night, perhaps sharing even part of it might ease the weight, even slightly." He looked at her for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering behind his controlled exterior. For a moment, she thought he might finally speak, might finally let the truth spill free after years of silent suffering. Instead, he looked away, shaking his head slowly. "Some truths, once spoken, cannot be taken back," he said quietly, echoing almost exactly the same warning Harlan had given them earlier that day. "I won't risk placing that weight upon you until I'm certain it's the right time." Disappointment settled heavily in Ilara's chest, though she understood his hesitation, even as it frustrated her. She rose from her chair, moving toward the door before pausing and turning back toward him one final time. "Whenever you're ready," she said softly. "I'll be here to listen." Without judgment. Draven watched her leave, his expression unreadable, though Caius's whispered voice followed her quietly down the corridor, murmuring words that sounded almost like gratitude tangled together with unbearable guilt. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Back in her own chamber, Ilara lay awake long into the night, turning over everything Harlan had revealed, and everything Draven had almost said, but ultimately withheld. Whatever truth waited at the end of this search, she now felt more certain than ever that Draven himself was not a villain, hiding cruelty behind a calm mask, but rather a man trapped by circumstances forced upon him, carrying guilt heavy enough to nearly break him beneath its weight. Tomorrow, she decided, she and Rhea would begin planning a journey toward the border village Harlan had mentioned, hoping to find Soren himself and finally uncover the complete truth hidden beneath years of careful silence and painful secrecy. Planning a secret journey away from Ashgrove Keep proved far more complicated than Ilara initially expected. As Luna, her absence would be noticed almost immediately, and any unexplained departure risked drawing exactly the kind of attention she and Rhea had worked so carefully to avoid. They spent several days quietly arranging a reasonable cover story, eventually settling on the idea of a healing mission to a neighboring pack, rumored to be suffering from a lingering fever outbreak, a task that fell naturally within both Ilara's role as healer and Rhea's official duties. Draven approved the arrangement without much hesitation when Ilara presented it to him during a quiet breakfast, though Caius's voice beneath his calm exterior carried a faint note of unease she couldn't quite place. "Be careful," he said simply. "Send word if anything delays your return." "I will," she promised, guilt twisting uncomfortably in her chest at the necessary deception layered beneath her request. Whatever justification she told herself, lying directly to her mate's face, felt increasingly difficult the longer she remained bonded to him. They departed 2 days later, accompanied by a small trusted escort of warriors, loyal to Rhea, rather than directly tied to the keep's inner political circles. The journey north stretched across 3 long days, winding through dense forest trails and rocky mountain passes, before finally descending into the quiet border village Harlan had described. The settlement was modest, a scattering of timber homes clustered around a central marketplace, smoke curling from chimneys against the crisp autumn air. Ilara and Rhea began their search carefully, posing as traveling healers offering medical assistance in exchange for information about local residents, hoping to identify Soren without drawing unwanted suspicion. It took 2 full days of careful inquiry before they found a promising lead, an elderly shopkeeper who mentioned a quiet healer living on the village outskirts. a man who had arrived several years earlier, with little explanation, and kept largely to himself ever since. Keeps mostly to his garden and his herbs, the shopkeeper said. Kind enough, though private, never talks about where he came from. Following the shopkeeper's directions, Elara and Ria made their way toward a small cottage at the edge of the settlement, surrounded by neatly tended rows of medicinal plants, despite the late autumn chill. A man emerged from the small structure as they approached, tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years living carefully beneath the radar of watchful eyes. He froze the moment he saw them, recognition and fear flashing across his features simultaneously. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Please, leave quickly, before anyone notices your presence." "Soren," Elara said gently, keeping her voice calm despite her racing heart. "We mean you no harm. We only wish to understand the truth about what happened years ago." His eyes widened slightly at the sound of his own name spoken aloud for what was likely the first time in years. "How do you know that name?" he demanded, though his tone carried more fear than aggression. "I'm the current Luna," Elara said carefully. "Draven's mate. I possess a rare gift that allows me to hear the inner voice of any shifter's wolf, separate from their spoken words. Draven's wolf has carried your name in guilt and sorrow since the moment I bonded with him. Whatever happened between you, it clearly still haunts him deeply." Soren's expression shifted through several emotions rapidly: disbelief, wariness, and finally something closer to exhausted relief, as though a weight he had carried alone for years might finally have found understanding ears. "Come inside," he said quietly, glancing nervously around the quiet street. "This isn't a conversation for open air." Once settled inside his modest cottage, surrounded by neat shelves of dried herbs and simple wooden furniture, Soren finally began to speak, his voice heavy with years of suppressed emotion. "The old king was dying, long before anyone else realized it," he began. "A slow illness, one he kept hidden from the council and the public alike, fearing it would weaken confidence in the pack's stability. Only Draven and I knew the full truth, since I served as his private advisor during those final months." Elara leaned forward, listening intently. As his illness worsened, Soren continued, certain council members began maneuvering quietly to challenge Draven's claim to succession, believing him too young, too inexperienced to hold the throne during such an uncertain time. The old king, desperate to secure his son's position before his death, made a decision I still struggle to fully accept even now. "What decision?" Ria asked softly. Soren's hands trembled slightly as he continued. "He forced Draven to publicly claim his death was accidental, rather than allowing the truth of his illness to become known, believing a sudden tragic accident would generate sympathy and swift unified support for Draven's immediate succession, rather than the uncertainty a lingering illness might create among a divided council." Alara's breath caught. He asked Draven to lie about his own father's death. "Not simply lie," Soren said quietly. "He forced Draven, on his deathbed, using their sacred bond as father and son, to promise silence about the true cause. Draven begged him not to ask this of him, argued that the truth deserved honor rather than deception, but his father insisted, believing it necessary to protect the kingdom's stability during a fragile transition of power. "And you knew the truth as well," Elara said. "I did," Soren admitted. "And shortly after the old king's death, when council members began growing suspicious of certain inconsistencies, I made the mistake of questioning things publicly, hoping perhaps the truth would finally emerge and relieve Draven of a burden I could see was already destroying him internally. I didn't yet understand the full situation myself, and my questions nearly exposed a secret Draven had promised, upon his father's memory, never to reveal." "What happened then?" Ria asked. "Draven came to me personally," Soren said, his voice thickening with emotion. "Not with threats, not with anger, but with genuine desperation. He told me the truth entirely, begged me to understand the impossible position his father had placed him in, and asked me to leave quietly, rather than force him to either break his sacred promise or watch me destroy the fragile peace, holding the kingdom together, during such an uncertain transition. He asked you to disappear willingly," Elara said slowly, understanding finally settling into place. "He did," Soren confirmed. "And he ensured my safe passage himself, arranging protection and resources so I could begin a new quiet life, far from the political dangers that truth would have created." He never wished me harm. If anything, he protected me as much as himself, by ensuring my silence came through choice rather than force. Ilara sat back, processing the weight of everything Soren had revealed. Draven had not caused his father's death, had not silenced Soren through violence or cruelty. He had simply carried an impossible promise made to a dying father, sacrificing his own integrity and peace of mind, to honor a request meant to protect a kingdom he had been thrust into leading far too young. Why has he never simply told the council the truth now, years later? Rhea asked. Surely enough time has passed that honesty would no longer destabilize anything. Soren shook his head slowly. A broken promise to a dying father is not something easily overcome, especially for someone who values honor as deeply as Draven does. He likely believes revealing the truth now would dishonor his father's memory entirely, even though I suspect continuing this silence causes him far greater suffering than honesty ever could. Ilara thought of Caius's endless whispered guilt, the desperate murmured apologies she had heard echoing beneath Draven's calm exterior since the very night of their bonding ceremony. Whatever pain he carried, it was clearly tearing him apart slowly from the inside, trapped between honoring a promise to his deceased father and living authentically with the mate fate had chosen for him. Will you help us? Ilara asked finally. Not by returning publicly, necessarily, but by allowing us to carry proof of this truth back to Draven, so he finally understands he no longer needs to carry this burden entirely alone. Soren considered the request for a long moment before nodding slowly. I'll write everything down, he said. A full account, signed and sealed, that you may show him privately. Perhaps knowing someone finally understands the full truth, without judgment, might finally allow him to begin healing from a wound he's carried silently for far too long. As Soren began preparing his written account late into the evening, Ilara felt a mixture of relief and heavy anticipation settling over her. The secret she and Rhea had spent weeks carefully investigating had finally revealed itself, not as villainy, but as tragedy. A young man forced into impossible silence by a father's desperate final request. Now, the only question remaining was how Draven would react once he finally learned that his secret had been discovered, and whether revealing what she knew would bring him relief, or shatter whatever fragile trust remained between them. The journey back toward Ashgrove Keep felt heavier than the journey outward had been, weighed down now by the sealed letter tucked carefully inside Ilara's traveling bag, containing Soren's full written account of everything that had truly happened years earlier. Rhea rode beside her in thoughtful silence for much of the return trip, occasionally glancing over with quiet concern. You're worried about how he'll react, Rhea said eventually, as their small group made camp on the second night of their return journey. Ilara stared into the small fire crackling between them, gathering her thoughts carefully. I'm worried about many things, she admitted. That he'll feel betrayed knowing I investigated behind his back. That revealing this truth might break something between us rather than heal it. That perhaps some secrets, once uncovered, cause more damage than the silence that protected them. But you don't truly believe that, Rhea said gently. Not anymore. Not after everything Soren told us. Ilara shook her head slowly. No, she admitted. I believe Draven has been suffering needlessly, trapped by a promise that no longer serves any real purpose, except to torture him privately every single day. I believe revealing this truth, gently and with compassion, could finally allow him to set down a burden he should never have carried alone in the first place. Then trust that belief, Rhea said simply. Whatever happens when you tell him, you're bringing him something he desperately needs, even if the process of receiving it feels painful at first. They arrived back at Ashgrove Keep 2 days later, greeted by the familiar sight of the towering stone walls rising against the autumn sky. Draven met them personally in the courtyard, as their small group dismounted, his expression a careful mixture of relief and lingering concern. You were gone longer than expected, he said, studying Ilara's face closely. I was beginning to worry. The fever outbreak required more attention than we initially anticipated, she said, the practiced lie feeling heavier now than it had before her journey, knowing the truth she carried back with her. Draven nodded, though Caius stirred restlessly beneath his calm exterior, murmuring something uneasy that Ilara couldn't quite decipher. A vague sense of unease, mixed with something almost like hopeful anticipation, as though some deep instinctive part of him sensed that everything was about to change. That evening, after settling back into the familiar rhythm of the keep, Ilara found herself standing outside Draven's private study once more. the sealed letter clutched tightly in her hands. She hesitated at the threshold for a long moment, gathering her courage before finally stepping forward and knocking softly. Draven looked up from his desk, surprise flickering briefly across his features at her unexpected late visit. "Elara," he said, straightening immediately. "Is something wrong?" "We need to talk," she said quietly, stepping into the room and closing the door firmly behind her. "There's something important I need to share with you, and I need you to listen until I've finished, even if what I say is difficult to hear." Draven's expression grew cautious, though he gestured toward the chair across from his desk without argument. "Of course," he said. "Whatever it is, I'm listening." Elara settled into the chair, taking a steadying breath before beginning. "Since the night of our bonding ceremony," she said carefully, "I've been able to hear something beyond your spoken words. Your wolf, Caius, speaks separately from you, carrying emotions and thoughts that your human voice never expresses aloud." Draven's face paled slightly, his hands tightening almost imperceptibly against the surface of his desk. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice suddenly guarded. "I've heard him whispering guilt since that very first night," Elara continued gently. "The word liar, repeated again and again, alongside grief and fear I didn't understand at first. Eventually, I heard him speak a name, Soren." Draven went completely still, his expression frozen somewhere between shock and dawning horror. "How?" he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "How could you possibly know that name?" "I began searching for answers," Elara admitted. "With Ria's help. We found old records, old letters, inconsistencies surrounding your father's death that eventually led us to a retired border guard, and finally to Soren himself." Draven rose abruptly from his chair, his composed exterior finally cracking entirely, raw emotion flooding across his features. "You found him," he said, disbelief and fear warring visibly in his expression. "You spoke with him directly?" "We did," Elara said gently, rising as well and stepping closer. "He told us everything, Draven. About your father's illness, about the promise he forced you to make, about why Soren truly left, and how you protected him rather than harming him. I understand now. I understand the impossible position you were placed in." Draven's breathing grew ragged, his hands trembling slightly, as the weight of years finally seemed to crash over him all at once. "You shouldn't have gone looking," he said, though his voice carried more anguish than anger. "You don't understand what you've risked. If certain council members ever learned the truth, everything could fracture. The stability my father sacrificed his own honesty to protect could collapse entirely." "I understand the risk," Elara said firmly, holding out the sealed letter toward him. "But I also understand that you've been carrying this alone for 5 years, Draven, suffering silently every single day, unable to share even with your own mate the truth eating away at you from the inside. That kind of solitary suffering isn't loyalty to your father's memory. It's simply unnecessary pain." Draven stared at the letter in her outstretched hand for a long moment without moving, his expression a storm of conflicting emotions. Finally, with trembling hands, he accepted it, breaking the seal carefully and beginning to read Soren's careful written account. Elara watched him silently as his eyes moved across the parchment, watched tears finally begin gathering in his eyes as he read words confirming everything he had carried alone for so long, now witnessed and understood by someone beyond himself. When he finished reading, he lowered the letter slowly, his shoulders shaking slightly with barely contained emotion. "I promised him," Draven said quietly, his voice breaking. "On his deathbed, I promised my father I would never reveal the truth. I've carried that promise like a stone around my neck every single day since, terrified that breaking it, even slightly, would somehow dishonor everything he sacrificed to protect this kingdom." Elara moved closer, gently taking his hand in hers. "Your father asked an impossible thing of you," she said softly. "A promise made from fear and desperation during his final moments, not necessarily wisdom. You've honored that promise far longer than any reasonable person could expect, at a cost to your own peace and happiness that I don't believe he ever truly intended." Draven looked at her then, vulnerability replacing the careful composure he had maintained for years, his eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears. "I don't know how to set this down," he admitted. "I've carried it so long, I'm not certain who I am without it." "You don't have to figure that out alone anymore," Elara said gently. "Whatever comes next, Whatever needs to happen regarding the council or the kingdom's stability, we'll face it together. You no longer need to carry this weight entirely by yourself." For the first time since their bonding ceremony, Caius's voice beneath Draven's exterior grew quiet, not silent from suppression, but calm, as though some small measure of relief had finally begun easing years of accumulated tension. Draven studied Alara's face for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind his eyes, gratitude and lingering fear tangled together with cautious, fragile hope. "Thank you," he whispered finally, his voice thick with emotion, "for finding the truth, for understanding, rather than judging, for staying, even now that you know everything." "I'm not going anywhere," Alara said firmly, squeezing his hand gently. "But Draven, we need to discuss what happens next. Because now that we know the truth, we also know Soren isn't the only danger surrounding this secret. If certain council members were involved in urging your father toward that deception, or worse, involved in ensuring the secret stayed buried through more dangerous means, we need to understand exactly who else might be protecting themselves by keeping this silence intact." Draven's expression sharpened slightly, old instincts returning beneath his emotional exhaustion. "You believe someone else within the council played a more active role," he said slowly. "I believe we need to find out," Alara said carefully. "Because whoever pressured your dying father toward this decision originally may still hold significant influence within your court today, and may not react calmly if they discover their secret has finally come to light." Draven nodded slowly, determination beginning to replace some of his earlier anguish. "Then we investigate together," he said firmly. "No more secrets, no more solitary burdens. Whatever danger surrounds this truth, we face it as true partners, exactly as fate intended when it bonded us together." For the first time since arriving at Ashgrove Keep, Alara felt something settle firmly into place between them, not simply the formal bond of Alpha King and Luna, but something deeper and more genuine, built now on shared truth rather than careful distance and hidden secrets. With the truth finally shared between them, Draven and Alara began working together in the following days, quietly reviewing old council records from the period surrounding his father's illness and death. Draven, now able to speak openly about memories he had suppressed for years, provided details that filled gaps neither Alara nor Rhea had been able to uncover alone. "My father grew ill gradually," he explained one evening, as the three of them gathered around the same table in the private library, candlelight flickering against stacks of old parchment. Only a handful of council members knew the full extent of his condition. Among them, one voice pressed harder than any other, toward concealing the truth entirely. "Who?" Alara asked. "Gideon," Draven said quietly, "my father's most trusted advisor at the time, and the head of the Eastern Council seat. He argued relentlessly that revealing my father's illness would embolden rival pacts to challenge our borders during a moment of perceived weakness. He convinced my father that framing his death as accidental would preserve stability far better than honest transparency." Rhea frowned thoughtfully. "Gideon still holds significant influence within the council today, doesn't he?" "More than most," Draven admitted grimly. "He's spent years positioning himself as an indispensable advisor, someone I've relied upon heavily since taking the throne. If he played a central role in convincing my father toward that deception, it's possible he did so not purely from concern for stability, but from a desire to secure his own continued influence and control behind the scenes." Alara considered this carefully. If Gideon orchestrated the concealment partly for his own benefit, he may have also played a direct role in ensuring Soren's silence, perhaps even beyond simply arranging his departure. Draven's expression darkened. "I always believed I alone arranged Soren's safe passage away from the keep," he said slowly. "But now that I think back clearly, Gideon offered unusually specific guidance during that period, suggesting particular routes, particular contacts along the eastern border. At the time, I assumed he was simply assisting me. Now, I wonder if he was ensuring things unfolded according to his own design, rather than mine." The three of them spent the following days carefully reviewing Gideon's activities during the relevant period, cross-referencing council meeting records, correspondence, and financial transactions hidden within old administrative logs. A troubling pattern slowly emerged. Shortly after the old king's death, Gideon had quietly expanded his personal holdings significantly, acquiring additional territory and trade agreements that had previously required the old king's direct approval, approvals that had mysteriously been granted during the final weeks of his illness, when Gideon held nearly unrestricted access to his failing king. "He used my father's illness to secure personal gain," Draven said, fury finally breaking through his usual composed exterior as they reviewed the damning evidence late one night, all while convincing him that concealing his death served the kingdom's greater good. "We need proof solid enough to bring before the full council," Rhea said carefully. "Gideon holds enough influence that accusations without ironclad evidence could easily be dismissed, or worse, turned back against us." Elara nodded in agreement, though a growing unease settled over her as they continued their careful investigation. If Gideon truly held such significant influence, and had already demonstrated willingness to manipulate a dying king for personal gain, exposing him now carried genuine danger, especially once he realized his secret was being actively investigated. Their concerns proved justified only days later, when Elara noticed a subtle shift in the household staff's behavior. Servants who had once greeted her warmly, now offering carefully guarded expressions, conversations falling suddenly quiet whenever she entered certain rooms. She mentioned this to Rhea during a quiet moment in the herb room. "Someone's watching us more closely," Rhea said, her expression tightening with concern. "Perhaps our inquiries haven't remained as quiet as we hoped." That evening, Draven confirmed their fears, arriving at Elara's chamber with visible tension etched across his features. "Gideon requested an unusual private meeting today," he said, closing the door quietly behind him. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd heard rumors of renewed interest in old matters best left undisturbed. He didn't specify what matters exactly, but his tone carried clear warning. Elara's stomach tightened with apprehension. "He knows we're investigating him." "Perhaps not with certainty," Draven said, though his expression remained troubled, "but enough suspicion that he felt compelled to warn me indirectly. Gideon rarely acts without purpose. If he suspects his secrets are at risk of exposure, he won't simply wait passively for us to gather proof against him." "What do you believe he'll do?" Rhea asked. Draven's jaw tightened. "I believe we need to move quickly, before he has opportunity to eliminate evidence, silence witnesses, or worse, position himself to strike first against us, before we're prepared to expose him properly." Elara thought immediately of Soren, still living quietly in his distant village, having only recently agreed to provide his written testimony after years of careful hiding. If Gideon suspected renewed investigation into these old secrets, Soren's safety might once again be at risk, especially if Gideon possessed resources capable of tracking down exactly where their earlier journey had led them. "We need to warn Soren," Elara said urgently. "If Gideon discovers we've spoken with him directly, his exposed location could put him in serious danger." "I'll send trusted riders immediately," Draven said, already moving toward the door, discreetly, avoiding anyone connected to Gideon's usual network of informants. As Draven hurried to arrange protection for Soren, Elara and Rhea remained behind, continuing to sort through their gathered evidence with renewed urgency, aware now that time had suddenly become a far more pressing concern than it had been only days earlier. "We need allies within the council itself," Rhea said thoughtfully as they worked. "Someone with genuine influence who isn't tied to Gideon's faction, someone who could help present this evidence credibly once we're ready to formally expose him." Elara considered this carefully. Draven mentioned trusting his beta, Garrick, though he seemed hesitant about something when I approached him weeks ago regarding Soren's disappearance. Perhaps his hesitation stemmed from suspecting Gideon's involvement without solid proof himself, Rhea suggested. If Garrick has quietly harbored similar suspicions for years, learning we now possess actual evidence might finally convince him to join our efforts openly. "It's worth approaching him again," Elara agreed, "especially now that time feels increasingly critical." They found Garrick training alone in the practice yard early the following morning, his expression guarded, as Elara approached with careful purpose. He listened in tense silence as she explained everything they had uncovered, his expression shifting gradually from wariness to grim understanding, as the pieces finally aligned with suspicions he had apparently carried quietly for years himself. "I always wondered about Gideon's sudden acquisitions following the old king's death," Garrick admitted once Elara finished. "I never possessed proof, only uncomfortable instinct. If you truly have documentation confirming his manipulation, I'll stand beside Draven when the time comes to expose him formally before the full council." "Thank you," Elara said, relief flooding through her at finally securing a powerful ally within the keep's political structure. We may need your support sooner than expected. Gideon already suspects renewed investigation into these matters. Garrick's expression sharpened with concern. Then we should prepare quickly, he said firmly. A man like Gideon, cornered and desperate, becomes significantly more dangerous than one who believes himself safely hidden. As the day progressed, tension continued building steadily throughout the keep, an undercurrent of unease settling over hallways that had once felt comfortably familiar to Alara. She found herself watching shadows more carefully, listening for footsteps behind her, aware that whatever careful investigation she and Rhea had begun weeks earlier had finally reached a critical turning point, one that could either finally bring long-overdue justice or plunge the entire kingdom into dangerous conflict should Gideon choose to fight rather than face exposure quietly. That evening, as she prepared for what increasingly felt like an inevitable confrontation looming just beyond the horizon, Ilara found herself standing once more beside Draven, near the same window overlooking the courtyard where their bonding ceremony had taken place months earlier. The moon hung heavy and full above the mountains, exactly as it had that first night, though everything between them now felt entirely transformed. "Whatever happens next," Draven said quietly, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I'm grateful you never stopped listening, even when staying silent would have been far easier." "I couldn't have stayed silent," Ilara replied softly. "Not once I understood what silence was truly costing you." Together, they watched the moon continue its slow ascent, both aware that the following days would likely determine not only their own fate, but the future stability of the entire kingdom they had been chosen to protect. News arrived 2 days later that shattered whatever fragile sense of preparation Ilara believed they had achieved. A rider returned from the eastern border village, his expression grim as he delivered his report directly to Draven, within the privacy of his study. "Soren's cottage was found empty," the rider said. "Neighbors reported strangers visiting the village only a day before we arrived, men who asked pointed questions before departing quickly. Soren himself is nowhere to be found." Ilara's stomach dropped with dread. "Gideon found him first." "We don't know that for certain," Draven said, though his tightened jaw betrayed his own suspicion. "But the timing feels far too coincidental to dismiss easily." Rhea, standing nearby, voiced the fear weighing heavily on all of them. "If Gideon has taken Soren, he now possesses a hostage capable of silencing our entire investigation. He could threaten Soren's safety to prevent us from presenting evidence before the council, or worse, eliminate him entirely, to remove the only living witness capable of confirming the truth." Draven's hands clenched into fists atop his desk. "Then we have even less time than we believed," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We need to move against Gideon before he has opportunity to use Soren against us, or to silence him permanently." Garrick arrived shortly after, having been summoned the moment news of Soren's disappearance reached the keep. His expression remained calm despite the mounting tension, though his eyes carried sharp focus as he listened to the developing situation. "We should request an emergency council session," he suggested. "Present our evidence formally, publicly, before Gideon has further opportunity to maneuver against us privately. Once the full council witnesses the evidence together, his ability to manipulate the situation quietly diminishes significantly. That risks pushing him toward desperate action," Draven countered. "If he believes exposure is imminent, regardless of what he does, he may act rashly, potentially endangering Soren further, or attempting some other drastic measure to protect himself. Then we corner him carefully," Ilara suggested, an idea forming quickly in her mind. "We request a private meeting first, just the four of us, confronting him directly with what we know. If we can convince him revealing everything peacefully serves his interests better than continued concealment, perhaps we secure Soren's safe return, without forcing public confrontation immediately." "And if he refuses to cooperate?" Rhea asked. "Then we proceed with the council session regardless," Ilara said firmly, "though we'll have given him a genuine opportunity to resolve this without further harm coming to anyone involved." Draven considered this carefully before nodding slowly. "It's a reasonable approach," he said, "though we should prepare thoroughly before that meeting, ensuring we understand every possible reaction he might have, and that we're prepared to respond regardless of which direction he chooses." They spent the remainder of the day preparing carefully, organizing every piece of evidence they had gathered into a clear, undeniable presentation, while Garrick quietly arranged additional loyal warriors to remain nearby during the confrontation, ensuring their safety should Gideon react with anything beyond simple denial or negotiation. The following morning, Draven requested Gideon's presence in his private study, framing the meeting as routine discussion regarding Eastern border trade agreements, careful not to reveal their true purpose until the moment arrived. Gideon entered with his usual composed confidence, an older man with sharp calculating eyes and silver hair swept back neatly from a face that had clearly spent decades mastering the art of controlled expression. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, offering a respectful bow before his eyes flickered briefly toward Alara, Rhea, and Garrick already seated within the room. "I wasn't aware this would be such a gathered audience for routine trade discussions." "This isn't about trade," Draven said evenly, gesturing toward an empty chair. "Please, sit. We have something important to discuss." Gideon's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, though he maintained his composed demeanor as he settled into the offered seat. "Of course," he said carefully. "What matter requires such particular attention?" Draven placed the gathered evidence carefully upon the table between them, watching Gideon's reaction closely as he began speaking. "We know about my father's illness," he said quietly. "We know about the deception surrounding his death, the true circumstances behind Soren's departure, and the personal gains you secured for yourself during that period, using influence you held over my dying father." Gideon's composed mask cracked slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the documents spread before him. "That's a serious accusation, Your Grace," he said carefully, his voice noticeably tighter than before. "One I would advise considering thoroughly before proceeding further." "We've considered it thoroughly," Alara said firmly, meeting his gaze directly. "We have documentation, testimony, and a clear pattern connecting every piece together. What we don't yet have is Soren, who disappeared from his hidden location only days after we began this investigation." Gideon's expression grew guarded, though something flickered behind his eyes that Alara recognized immediately as calculation rather than genuine confusion. "I don't know what you're implying," he said carefully. "We're implying that you found him before we could secure his safety," Draven said, his voice hardening. "And we want him returned unharmed, immediately." Silence stretched tensely across the room, as Gideon studied each of them carefully, clearly weighing his options. Finally, his composed exterior shifted into something colder, more calculating. "Your father understood the necessity of difficult decisions for the greater good of this kingdom," he said quietly. "I merely helped him make choices he lacked the strength to make alone during his final weakened days. Everything I did to preserve stability during an uncertain transition." "You did it to enrich yourself," Garrick said sharply, speaking for the first time since entering the room. "The territorial acquisitions, the trade agreements secured during his illness, those weren't decisions made for the kingdom's benefit. They were made for yours alone." Gideon's eyes flashed with sudden anger, his careful composure finally slipping entirely. "Careful, Garrick," he said coldly. "Accusations without absolute proof can prove dangerous for everyone involved, including those making them." "Is that a threat?" Alara asked, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the room. "Merely an observation," Gideon said smoothly, though the underlying warning remained unmistakable. "This kingdom remains fragile even now, 5 years after that unfortunate transition. Exposing old wounds publicly could reignite exactly the kind of instability my actions originally prevented. Perhaps it would serve everyone better if this conversation remained private, unrepeated, beyond these walls." "Where is Soren?" Draven demanded, his voice sharp with barely controlled fury. Gideon studied him for a long moment before responding. "Safe, for now," he said carefully, "though his continued safety depends entirely upon how this conversation concludes." That confirmed everything Alara needed to know. Gideon held Soren captive somewhere, using his safety as leverage to prevent them from proceeding further with their investigation. "You'll release him immediately," Draven said, rising from his chair, his authority as Alpha King radiating powerfully through the room. "Or I will call an emergency council session this very afternoon, presenting every piece of evidence we possess, along with your explicit confirmation just now that you're holding a kidnapped witness against his will." Gideon's expression tightened, clearly recognizing that his careful control over the situation had suddenly slipped away entirely. "You wouldn't risk the kingdom's stability so recklessly," he said, though uncertainty had crept into his previously confident tone. "I would risk anything to protect the people I love and the kingdom I'm sworn to serve honestly," Draven said firmly. including finally confronting a truth I should never have allowed to remain hidden for so long in the first place. The room fell into tense silence, every person present understanding that the confrontation had reached its critical turning point. Gideon's eyes flickered rapidly between each of them, clearly recalculating his options, as his carefully constructed position of power crumbled visibly before him. Finally, after a long, heavy pause, he spoke again, his voice noticeably strained. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we can find a resolution that serves everyone's interests without unnecessary chaos." "Release Soren," Draven repeated firmly. "Now, and then we'll discuss exactly what resolution looks like moving forward." Gideon's jaw tightened, clearly recognizing he had lost his advantage entirely. "Very well," he said finally, though his tone carried simmering resentment beneath forced calm. "I'll have him brought here immediately." As Gideon rose to leave the room under Garrick's watchful escort, Elara felt a cautious wave of relief beginning to settle over her, though she remained acutely aware that this confrontation, however successful so far, was far from truly over. Gideon's cornered agreement felt more like a tactical retreat than genuine surrender, and something told her the most dangerous portion of this conflict still waited just ahead. Soren arrived at the keep under heavy guard barely an hour later, thinner and visibly shaken but otherwise unharmed, escorted by warriors loyal to Garrick who had been dispatched the moment Gideon revealed his location. Elara rushed to meet him as he entered the courtyard, relief flooding through her at the sight of him alive and safe. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, his voice trembling with exhaustion. "His men found me only a day after you left. I didn't tell them anything more than they already suspected, but I couldn't prevent them from taking me." "You did nothing wrong," Elara reassured him gently, guiding him toward the healer's quarters where Rhea waited to examine him properly. "What matters now is that you're safe, and that the truth is finally coming to light." While Rhea tended to Soren's minor injuries and exhaustion, Draven remained in his study, quietly monitoring Gideon's movements through trusted guards, while preparing for whatever confrontation still awaited them. Garrick joined him there, his expression grim with concentration. "He won't simply accept defeat quietly," Garrick warned. "A man like Gideon has spent years building networks of loyalty and obligation throughout the council. Even cornered, he likely still possesses allies willing to support him, particularly if he frames this situation carefully enough before we can present our evidence formally." Draven nodded grimly. "Then we move quickly, before he has opportunity to rally support against us. I'll call the emergency council session for this evening." News of the sudden council summons spread rapidly throughout the keep, whispered speculation trailing through hallways, as nobles and advisors began gathering within the Grand Council chamber, as the sun began setting behind the mountains. Elara stood beside Draven at the head of the chamber, Soren's written testimony held carefully in her hands, while Rhea and Garrick remained close by, prepared to support whatever unfolded next. Gideon arrived last, his expression carefully composed once more, though Elara noticed tension coiled tightly beneath his controlled exterior, as he took his customary seat among the assembled council members. Several other advisors exchanged uncertain glances, clearly sensing that this gathering carried far greater weight than typical routine matters. Draven rose to address the assembled council, his voice steady and commanding despite the personal vulnerability of what he was about to reveal. 5 years ago, he began, my father did not die from an accidental fall during routine patrol, as this council has believed all this time. Murmurs rippled immediately through the gathered nobles, confusion and alarm flickering across numerous faces. Gideon's expression remained carefully neutral, though his hands tightened almost imperceptibly against the armrests of his chair. My father was gravely ill in his final months, Draven continued, his voice thick with old grief finally being released into open air after years of suppression. Fearing that revealing his illness would destabilize the kingdom during a fragile transition, he asked me to conceal the truth, to allow the story of an accidental death to stand in its place. I have carried that promise silently for 5 years, believing I was honoring his memory. He paused, glancing briefly toward Gideon before continuing. However, I have recently learned that this deception was not solely my father's idea, born purely from concern for stability. It was heavily influenced, even orchestrated, by someone within this very council, who used my father's weakened state and desperate fear to secure significant personal gains for himself. The chamber erupted into startled whispers, dozens of eyes turning slowly toward Gideon, whose composed mask finally began cracking visibly under the mounting scrutiny. "This is a serious accusation to level without proof, Your Grace," Gideon said, his voice tight despite his attempt at calm authority. "I would advise caution before making claims that could unsettle this council so severely." "We have proof," Ilara said clearly, stepping forward and presenting the gathered documentation before the assembled nobles. Financial records showing territorial acquisitions and trade agreements secured suspiciously during the exact weeks of the old king's declining health. Agreements requiring his direct approval that should never have been granted so easily during such critical illness. She continued, gesturing toward Soren, who stood quietly nearby, having insisted on being present despite his recent ordeal. "And we have direct testimony from Soren, the old king's private advisor during those final months, who witnessed firsthand the pressure exerted upon a dying king, and who was subsequently forced into hiding to prevent this truth from ever coming to light." Soren stepped forward then, his voice steady despite lingering exhaustion. "Everything stated here is true," he said clearly, addressing the assembled council directly. "I witnessed Gideon's manipulation personally. I was forced to disappear because my knowledge threatened to expose him. And only days ago, his men found me hiding and held me against my will to prevent this very truth from reaching this chamber." The room fell into stunned silence, every eye now fixed firmly upon Gideon, whose careful composure had finally collapsed entirely under the weight of undeniable evidence and direct testimony presented before witnesses he could no longer control or intimidate into silence. "This is outrageous," Gideon finally sputtered, though his voice carried desperation rather than genuine conviction. "Fabricated evidence, coerced testimony. This entire presentation is clearly designed to distract from more pressing matters facing this kingdom." "Enough," Draven said firmly, his voice carrying absolute authority throughout the chamber. "You held a kidnapped witness against his will only hours ago, a fact you confirmed personally in my private study this very morning. Deny it if you wish, but Garrick himself witnessed your confirmation directly." Garrick nodded firmly in agreement, his expression unwavering as council members turned toward him for confirmation. "Every word spoken here today is accurate," he said clearly. "I witnessed Gideon's admission personally." Gideon's expression finally crumbled entirely, recognizing that his careful decades of constructed influence had collapsed beyond any hope of recovery. Whatever calculating composure had sustained him through years of manipulation finally gave way to something closer to desperate resignation. "Everything I did to protect this kingdom during its most vulnerable moment," he said quietly, though the words carried hollow justification rather than genuine conviction, now that his true motivations stood exposed before the entire council. "You did it to protect your own growing power and wealth," Draven said firmly, "using my father's weakened state and my own inexperienced grief to secure advantages that served only yourself, while forcing me to carry the weight of a lie that has tormented me for 5 long years." The council chamber remained tensely silent as Draven turned finally toward the assembled nobles, addressing them directly, with renewed conviction. "This council will decide Gideon's fate, according to our established laws regarding manipulation of the throne and unlawful detention of witnesses," he said clearly. "But regardless of that outcome, I stand before you today choosing honesty over continued silence, choosing to honor my father's memory not through deception, but through truth and accountability. Values I believe he ultimately would have wanted his kingdom built upon, rather than fear-driven concealment." Murmurs of support began rippling through the gathered nobles, many nodding slowly in agreement, clearly moved by Draven's vulnerable honesty, rather than the controlled composure they had grown accustomed to witnessing from their king. Several council members immediately called for Gideon's removal from his position and formal investigation into his broader activities throughout his years of influence. As guards moved forward to escort Gideon from the chamber pending further investigation, Ilara felt Draven's hand find hers beside her, his grip trembling slightly with the emotional weight of finally releasing a truth he had carried alone for so long. She squeezed his hand firmly in return, silent reassurance passing between them as the chamber slowly began settling from its earlier uproar into quieter, more thoughtful discussion regarding the kingdom's path forward. Beneath his composed exterior, for the first time since Ilara had bonded with him months earlier, Caius's voice fell completely silent, not from suppression or guilt, but from genuine peace, finally free from the crushing weight of secrecy that had haunted him relentlessly since the night of his father's death. In the weeks following Gideon's removal from power, Ashgrove Keep slowly settled into a new rhythm, one built upon a foundation far more honest than anything the kingdom had known during the previous 5 years. The council conducted a thorough investigation into Gideon's activities, eventually confirming numerous additional instances of manipulation and personal enrichment, stretching back even further than anyone had initially suspected. He was formally stripped of his title and holdings, his fate ultimately decided through proper pack law, rather than secretive backroom dealings, a small but meaningful symbol of the transparency Draven now championed openly. Soren remained at the keep for several weeks following the council session, finally able to speak freely about his past without fear of retribution. Draven personally ensured he received both an official pardon for his earlier forced disappearance and generous compensation for the years of hidden life he had been forced to endure. Eventually, Soren chose to return to his quiet cottage in the eastern village, though now visiting Ashgrove Keep openly whenever he wished, finally free from the shadow of secrecy that had defined his existence for so long. Elara continued her work alongside Rhea within the healer's quarters, though her role within the keep had shifted noticeably since the truth had come to light. Pack members who once offered polite but distant respect now approached her with genuine warmth, having witnessed firsthand her courage in helping uncover truth, even when doing so carried significant personal risk. She found herself settling more comfortably into her role as Luna, no longer feeling like an outsider navigating unfamiliar political waters, but rather like someone who genuinely belonged within the community she now called home. Her bond with Draven deepened considerably during this period as well, transformed entirely from the careful distance and hidden observation that had characterized their early days together. Draven, finally free from the crushing weight of his solitary secret, revealed a warmth and openness that had clearly been suppressed beneath years of careful control. He laughed more easily now, Elara noticed, genuine amusement replacing the practiced diplomatic smiles he had once offered so carefully to everyone around him, including her. One quiet evening, several weeks after the council session that had finally exposed Gideon's manipulation, Elara found Draven standing near the same courtyard window where their bonding ceremony had taken place months earlier, the full moon once again hanging heavy and bright above the surrounding mountains. "You seem thoughtful tonight," she said softly, moving to stand beside him. "I was remembering that first night," he admitted, glancing toward her with an expression far more open than anything she had witnessed from him during those early uncertain weeks. "I was so terrified you would hear something within me that would make you turn away entirely. Instead, you heard my pain and chose to help me carry it, even before I understood what courage that decision truly required." "I could never have simply ignored what I heard," Elara said gently, "not once I understood how deeply that secret was hurting you." Draven turned to face her fully, taking both her hands within his own. "Caius has been quiet these past weeks," he said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "Not silent from suppression, but peaceful, truly at rest, for the first time since my father's death. I owe that peace entirely to you, Elara. To your courage in pursuing truth, even when doing so risked everything between us. We pursued it together," she reminded him gently, "along with Rhea and Garrick, and ultimately Soren's own bravery in finally speaking the truth after years of forced silence." Draven nodded, though his gaze remained fixed warmly upon her. "Still," he said quietly, "none of it would have happened without your gift, and more importantly, without your compassion in choosing to use that gift toward healing rather than judgment." Elara felt warmth spreading through her chest at his words, genuine happiness settling comfortably into place after months of careful uncertainty and hidden investigation. Whatever challenges still lay ahead for the kingdom, she felt confident now that she and Draven would face them together, as true partners bound not simply by fate's mysterious moon blessing, but by hard-won mutual trust and shared understanding. In the months that followed, the kingdom continued adjusting to its new era of transparency, under Draven's renewed leadership. Council sessions grew more open, decisions made with greater collective input rather than concentrated secretive influence. Garrick took on expanded responsibilities as Draven's most trusted advisor, filling the void left by Gideon's removal with genuine loyalty rather than calculated ambition. Rhea's healing work continued expanding as well, eventually training additional healers throughout the surrounding villages to ensure care reached every corner of Pack territory, rather than remaining concentrated solely within the keep itself. As the next blood moon ceremony approached, nearly a full year after Alara's own bonding to Draven, the kingdom gathered once again within the same courtyard where their story had first begun, this time celebrating not a mysterious new bonding, but rather a public renewal ceremony that Draven himself had requested, wanting his people to witness firsthand the strength their partnership had built through honesty rather than concealment. Standing before the assembled crowd beneath the same bright silver moon that had first blessed their union, Alara listened once more to the voice beneath Draven's calm exterior. No longer haunted whispers of guilt and fear, but something entirely different now. Steady warmth and genuine contentment radiating clearly from the wolf, finally at peace within him. "I am grateful every single day," Draven said to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet courtyard, "that fate chose to bless me with a mate capable of hearing truths I could never have spoken aloud myself. Alara did not simply become my Luna that night beneath this moon. She became the reason I finally found the courage to set down a burden that nearly broke me entirely, and to build something far stronger in its place. A partnership built upon honesty rather than fear." The crowd erupted into warm applause and joyful howls directed toward the bright moon above, celebrating not just their king and his mate, but the transformed spirit of honesty and unity that now defined their entire kingdom. Alara looked toward Draven, her heart full with everything they had overcome together, and beneath his warm smile, she heard Caius one final time that evening, no longer whispering guilt or fear, but simply, quietly, contentedly, expressing gratitude for having finally found peace beside the mate who had chosen understanding over judgment, and truth over comfortable silence. As the celebration continued late into the night, beneath the glowing silver moon, Alara realized that her rare gift, once feared as a burden capable of exposing dangerous secrets, had ultimately become something far more valuable. A bridge that had allowed two wounded souls to find genuine connection through truth rather than distance, proving that even the most difficult secrets, once faced honestly and courageously together, could ultimately lead not toward destruction, but toward the deepest kind of lasting peace and belonging either of them had ever known.